Ifeoma staggered through the wooden gate with a heavy bundle of firewood balanced on her head, her wrapper soaked with sweat and clinging tightly to her body, while her baby shifted weakly where he was tied against her chest, and her legs dragged slowly as if they already knew something inside her home had changed before she even stepped fully into the yard, and there, under the shade beside the mud house, she had spent years struggling to protect with her silence. Her husband was lying comfortably on the wooden bench as though the weight she carried every day did not exist, while two elder women stood nearby watching her with the same serious faces that had followed her for months whenever they reminded her what a good wife must endure to keep her marriage from breaking. That was the afternoon she finally did exactly what the elder women told her would save her marriage. But before the sun disappeared that evening, something happened inside that same compound that made her realize the advice she trusted for so long was quietly leading her somewhere she never expected somewhere. No woman ever prepares her heart to go. Sit back as we unveil this shocking story. There are women in every village who carry their lives quietly, whose strength is so ordinary to those around them that it stops looking like strength at all. Ifeoma was one of those women. Inumues, the small farming community nestled between two shallow rivers and a long stretch of red-soiled cassava farms, Ifeoma's name was rarely spoken without some word of admiration attached to it. That Ifeoma, she is a hard-working woman. That Ifeoma, she knows how to keep her home. That Ifeoma does not give her husband trouble. The admiration was genuine. But it was also the kind that quietly expected something in return, expected her to keep being exactly what she had always been, no matter what the cost of being that was doing to her body and her spirit. She had grown up in a household that taught women early that the success of a marriage was proof of a woman's character. Her mother had endured much and called it wisdom. Her aunts had stayed in difficult situations and called it dignity. The message was never spoken plainly, but it settled into Ifeoma's bones the way the harmattan settles into everything invisible, pervasive, impossible to fully wash away. A good woman keeps her home. A patient woman restores peace. A wise woman does not cause her husband shame by making their private struggles visible to outside eyes. When Ifeoma married Emeka in the dry season 12 years ago, she believed she had found a man who would build alongside her. Emeka was charming in the way of young men, with plans, his eyes bright with purpose, his hands always busy with fabric and thread, his mouth full of the kind of confident dreams that make a young woman believe a life is really beginning. He was a tailoring apprentice under a respected man in the next town, and he spoke often about the day he would have his own shop with his name painted above the door in blue and white. He spoke about it with the certainty of someone who had already earned it, and Ifeoma, who loved the sound of certainty, had listened and believed him completely. Their early years were not without difficulty, but difficulty in those years had a different texture. It was the difficulty of building something together, of learning each other's rhythms, of stretching small money across large needs, with the creative optimism of people who believed the future would be kinder than the present. When Obinna was born, the joy of that small, perfect boy filled whatever gaps were beginning to form between them, and for a while the household felt whole. The cracking began quietly, the way damage to a foundation always does, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, almost unnoticeable settling. the sewing machine broke. It was an old machine, second-hand, when Emeka received it, and its breaking was not entirely a surprise, but the way Emeka responded to its breaking was. He was discouraged in a way that seemed to go deeper than the machine itself, as though the broken machine confirmed a fear he had already been carrying privately for some time. He tried for a few weeks to have it repaired, visited 2 different mechanics, argued about the cost, and then gradually stopped mentioning it altogether. The visits to the mechanics became rarer, then stopped. The fabrics that customers had brought to him were quietly returned or forgotten. The dream of the shop, with his name above the door, stopped appearing in his conversations. Ifeoma waited. She was patient. She prayed quietly in the mornings before Obinna woke and asked God to restore her husband's direction. She told herself that men who hit difficulties sometimes needed time to recover their footing, the way a man who slips on wet ground needs a moment to stand before he can walk again. She covered for Emeka when neighbours asked questions. She found reasons to explain his idleness that preserved his dignity. And she began, quietly and without announcement, to expand her own work, to compensate for what was no longer coming from his. The cassava farm at the edge of the village had always been part of her life, but now it became the centre of it. She woke before the cock crowed to tend the rows, returning home to prepare Obinna for school, then going back to farm through the heat of the afternoon, then carrying whatever she harvested to the roadside market, where she laid it out on a cloth and waited, Obinna sometimes beside her, for buyers who came and went slowly on market days. She sold pepper. She sold palm oil from trees she tapped herself. She carried water for neighbours who paid her small amounts and accepted those small amounts without complaint, because small amounts, carefully managed, could still become enough. All of this she did while Emeka rested, while neighbours came and sat with him in the compound and spoke about politics and football. While he received visits from his friend Obiora, who was a loud and persuasive man with a gift for making laziness sound like dignity. Obiora was the kind of friend who brought palm wine and took away ambition. He had opinions about everything, and chief among them was the opinion that a real man does not lower himself by living off his wife's income, which meant, in practice, that Emeka should not feel pressure to work, because feeling pressure would mean admitting something shameful. Obiora helped Emeka stay comfortable by helping him believe that staying comfortable was actually a matter of pride. The elder women, meanwhile, were on Ifeoma's side, or so it felt at first. Mama Nkechi, the most prominent among them, was a stout woman of 63 years who had outlasted 2 difficult marriages and raised 5 children largely alone. She had seen more domestic suffering than most people could imagine, and she had arrived at a set of conclusions from that suffering that she now dispensed to younger women the way a pharmacist dispenses medicine with authority, with certainty, and with a belief in the prescription that was absolute. Her conclusion, drawn from a life's worth of experience, was that endurance was the medicine that cured troubled marriages. Stay. Be patient. Do not create more noise than the home can carry. Feed your husband well, speak softly, and the tide will eventually turn. She advised Ifeoma with genuine love. That is the thing that must be understood clearly. Mama Nkechi was not a wicked woman. She was not trying to harm this young wife she had watched grow up in the village. She believed, with all the sincerity of a woman who had survived by following this same advice, that what had saved her could save Ifeoma too. She did not see that what she had survived and what Ifeoma was surviving were different. She did not see that surviving is not the same as living well. And she did not see that the prescription she trusted so completely was not curing anything. It was only teaching Ifeoma to become more efficient at carrying a weight that should have been shared. As the months accumulated and then stretched into another year, Ifeoma's body began keeping records that her heart was too loyal to keep. Her hands, once smooth from youth, became rough and cracked in the way of women twice her age. The muscles in her neck and shoulders knotted permanently from the weight of firewood, water, and produced balance daily on her head. She developed a cough during the rainy season that year that would not fully leave, because she was often out in wet weather and sleeping on a mat that was no longer adequate because she had spent the money for a proper mattress on Abina's school fees and Emeka's treatment when a tooth went bad and there was nothing left. She ate last, and sometimes she ate less than what she needed, not because food was entirely unavailable, but because ensuring that Emeka and Abina had enough first sometimes left the pot too shallow for proper portions for herself. The school contribution requests had started coming in regular waves as Abina moved into the higher primary classes. Each new term brought a new uniform, a new set of books, sports fees, PTA levies, end-of-year party contributions. Each wave washed against Ifeoma alone, because when she quietly raised the subject with Emeka, he would nod with a distracted expression and say he would handle it. And then the days would pass, and the school deadline would approach, and nothing would be handled. And Ifeoma would find herself in the market at 6 a.m, selling faster, moving faster, calculating with the kind of mental speed born of desperation. When Obinna fell sick that rainy season, the fever that came with chills and a cough that frightened her with its depth, Ifeoma sat up 3 nights in a row, pressing wet cloth to her son's small forehead. She carried him to the dispensary herself because Emeka was visiting Obiora's compound that afternoon and she did not want to wait. She paid from the savings she kept folded inside the wrapper she used only for important occasions. She prepared the medicines herself. She washed the bedding herself when the sickness caused accidents in the night. And when Obinna finally recovered and smiled at her with his father's exact smile, she felt the relief of it so fully that she cried quietly in the kitchen while she cooked, not entirely from joy, but from a mixture of joy and the exhaustion of having been the only person between her child and danger. Through all of this, she did not argue loudly. She did not throw things or call names or go to her mother's compound and air the family's situation in the street. She remembered Mama Nkechi's words, "A woman who creates noise destroys the very thing she is trying to protect." So she swallowed what needed swallowing. She smiled when smiling was required. She maintained the appearance of a home that was functioning because she was determined that it would function, and because she had, somewhere deep inside her, confused suffering quietly with keeping her marriage alive. But silence, sustained long enough without response, does not remain neutral. It begins to work on the person maintaining it. Ifeoma began to dream differently. Dreams she had carried for herself, small ones. Nothing extravagant began appearing less and less. She had once thought about extending her trading, buying a small freezer to sell cold water and soft drinks on the roadside. She had mentioned it to Emeka years ago, and he had said it was a good idea, and she had believed it was something they would plan together. But planning together required a partner who showed up for the planning, and so the freezer remained a dream, while the energy she might have used to pursue it went instead into maintaining what already existed. Neighbours noticed the imbalance. Umueze was the kind of community where nothing stayed entirely private, where the morning greetings exchanged at the well were full of subtext that every woman understood, where eyes tracked who was working and who was not, without anyone needing to say so openly. Women who collected water alongside Ifeoma saw the tiredness in her face and said nothing directly but offered extra help, sometimes an extra hand with firewood, a portion of food sent over without explanation, a willingness to watch Obinna for an afternoon. These offerings were the community's quiet acknowledgement that something was wrong, delivered in the gentle, indirect language that village women use when they want to help without causing shame. One neighbour in particular, a woman named Adeiz, who lived 2 compounds away, had been watching Ifeoma's situation with increasing concern. Adeiz was younger than Mama Nkechi and had grown up with different ideas. She had spent 3 years in the city working in a trading company before returning to marry, and she had come back with the city's more straightforward way of naming things. She saw what the elder women's advice was actually producing. Not a restored marriage, but an increasingly depleted woman. She could not say this loudly without creating conflict with the elders who would consider her inexperienced and disrespectful. But she found quiet ways to show Ifeoma that another perspective existed. Small conversations, gentle questions, the food support that arrived without announcement. She planted seeds of something without being sure that Ifeoma was ready to let them grow. Meanwhile, Obiora continued his careful maintenance of Emeka's comfortable stillness. He had the talent of a man who convinces others that their limitations are actually principles. He would sit with Emeka in the compound and say things like, "A man must not be rushed. A man who chases after his wife's approval has already lost his authority in that house." And Emeka, who had lost the clear vision of himself he once had as an apprentice with plans, found in Obiora's words a substitute for the pride he had not yet rebuilt through actual work. He borrowed dignity from Obiora's speeches, the way a man with no lantern borrows light from a neighbour's fire. It illuminated nothing in his own house, but it was enough to feel warm by, while the darkness remained. The silence between Ifeoma and Emeka deepened past arguments. Arguments, at least, require engagement. What settled into their home was something quieter and more corrosive, a mutual avoidance that had the surface appearance of peace and the interior of cold water. They spoke when they needed to. They shared the space of their mud house and their compound without sharing the weight of their lives. And Ifeoma continued, morning after morning, wrapping her tiredness in patience and her patience in the words of elder women, and carrying it all out through the wooden gate and into whatever the day required of her. Every story has layers that its central character cannot see because she is standing too close to the centre. Mama Nkechi, advising Ifeoma from a place of true concern, carried her own invisible weight. She had been, in her youth, a woman who spoke her mind too quickly in her first marriage, and the result a husband who left, children who grew up confused, A community that judged her for years had cost her more than she was willing to ever fully revisit. She had rebuilt herself slowly, learning through the rebuilding that softness and endurance and patience were the tools that had finally, in her second marriage, produced something stable. She believed it completely. The belief was not a performance, it was a scar that had become a philosophy, the way wounds sometimes do when a person has lived with them long enough. And so when she looked at Ifeoma and offered her wisdom, she was offering the truest thing she had, which was the lesson that her own pain had taught her. What she could not see was that Ifeoma was not her younger self. The situations were not the same. Ifeoma was not a woman speaking too quickly. She was a woman who had not spoken at all for too long. And the effect of that silence was the opposite of what Mama Nkechi's own silence had once produced. In Mama Nkechi's second marriage, her quietness had met a husband who was fundamentally willing to work and simply needed peace to do it. In Ifeoma's marriage, her quietness was meeting a husband who was fundamentally comfortable with being still and whose comfort was being actively maintained by a friend who called that stillness dignity. These two situations required different medicines. But because Mama Nkechi saw only the surface similarity, woman enduring marriage in difficulty, she offered the same prescription she always offered, not knowing it was the wrong one for this particular illness. Obiora, in his corner of the story, was not a villain in the way that stories sometimes need villains. He was a man of limited imagination who had turned his limitations into a social identity. He had never built anything significant himself. He moved between schemes that started loudly and ended quietly, and the gap between his ambitions and his achievements had long ago been papered over by a personality loud enough to distract from it. His advice to Emeka was the advice he gave himself. A man with pride does not admit he needs to start over. A man with pride waits until circumstances improve. The advice suited Obiora because it excused his own stagnation, and he gave it freely to Emeka because giving it reinforced it in himself as well. He was not deliberately destroying Emeka's marriage. He was just protecting his own ego in ways that cost someone else's wife her health. Adaeze, in her quiet corner, watched these threads with the clarity of someone who was not entangled in them. She did not interfere directly, because interfering directly in another woman's marriage was a line that even her more modern thinking respected. A woman's private decisions were her own, and pushing too hard against them could create a different kind of harm. But she kept the door of her small compound open. She kept the food portions generous when Ifeoma passed. She kept her voice soft and curious when she asked questions that were really invitations for Ifeoma to examine her own situation without anyone naming it for her. She was planting without knowing exactly what would grow, but she kept planting. And Emeka, what was happening inside Emeka during all these months? It would be too easy to call him simply selfish, though his behaviour was certainly selfish in its effects. The truth was more complicated. Emeka was a man who had lost his sense of himself when the machine broke, and instead of doing the hard work of finding a new sense of himself, he had accepted Obiora's substitute. The substitute was comfortable, and comfort, once occupied long enough, becomes very difficult to leave voluntarily. He watched Ifeoma work without seeing it, the way a man who lives near a waterfall eventually stops hearing the water. Her work had become background, not invisible exactly, but no longer distinct, no longer registered as something separate from the general functioning of the household. He was not heartless. There were moments, late in the night, when he lay awake and the compound was quiet, when something moved in him that was close to shame. But shame in the night, without action in the day, is only pain, it is not change. These were the invisible threads pulling at each other quietly behind the daily surface of life in the compound, while Ifeoma wrapped her wrapper each morning and went back to work and trusted that endurance was building something, not knowing it was slowly emptying her instead. The afternoon it happened was not a day that had announced itself as different. Ifeoma had left before full sunrise, tying Obinna carefully against her chest, a thin cloth wrapped twice over to secure him because he was still recovering from the worst of his illness, and she could not leave him behind, and there was no one available to watch him at that early hour. She went to the farm, working through the morning with Obinna drowsing against her chest, his weight an added strain on her already tight back and shoulders. By midday, she had cut enough firewood to justify the trip to the market, and had bundled it with rope she always kept tied at her waist for this purpose. The walk back to the compound was longer than it usually felt. The firewood bundle was heavier than usual. She had pushed herself to collect more because the money from the previous market day had been entirely absorbed by the remaining balance on Obinna's clinic fee, and she needed this day to produce more than usual. Obinna stirred occasionally against her chest, his breath still not quite as regular as a fully healthy child's breath, and each time he stirred, she adjusted her walk to smooth the movement for him. The sun was strong. The red road dust rose around her feet in small clouds. Her legs did not feel like her own legs. They felt like borrowed legs she was renting from someone who was not being very generous with the loan. She was thinking about nothing by the time she reached the wooden gate. That is what exhaustion does. When it is deep enough, it clears the mind of everything that is not the immediate requirement of continued movement. She pushed the gate with her hip and stepped into the yard. Emeka was on the wooden bench under the shade of the large mango tree that spread its arms over the side of the compound. He was there with 3 other men she recognized, 2 neighbors and Obiora, who was in the middle of a story that had all of them leaning forward slightly with the attention of men expecting a punchline. There were empty bottles of palm wine near the bench. The laughter that had been rising from the group stopped briefly when Ifeoma entered, and then continued, because her entrance was not the kind that required acknowledgement. Mama Nkechi was there too, standing slightly apart from the men near the side of the house, having apparently come to check on something, a pot of soup she had earlier told Ifeoma she would help with. Though the pot on the fire pit showed no evidence of recent attention, beside her was Nena, another elder woman who had been advising Ifeoma for months, nodding whenever Mama Nkechi spoke, adding the weight of her own presence to whatever instruction was being given. Ifeoma registered all of this the way a person registers scenery from a moving vehicle quickly, without full processing. She was focused on reaching the spot near the kitchen where she could set down the firewood and release the tension in her neck. She was focused on unwrapping Obinna gently so he could lie down properly. She did not make it to the kitchen. It happened between the gate and the cooking area, a sudden tilting of the world, a sensation of the ground rushing upward, and then the crash of the firewood bundle hitting the red earth as her legs buckled completely beneath her. She did not lose consciousness, which meant she experienced everything that followed with a terrible, detailed clarity. She felt the earth under her hands. She felt Obinna pressed against her as she went down. and even in falling she twisted instinctively to protect him, taking the impact on her side rather than her front. She heard the firewood scatter. She heard the sounds from the compound change, the laughter cutting off sharply, a woman's voice saying something in alarm, footsteps. What she saw when the vertigo cleared enough for her to see clearly was this: neighbours running toward her. Adaeze, who must have been near her gate when it happened, appearing at her side with a swiftness that suggested she had been watching the yard, pressing cool hands against Ifeoma's face and speaking quickly. The elder women, Mama Nkechi and Nena, standing in place for a moment too long, long enough for the delay to be visible before stepping forward, and Emeka rising slowly from the bench, the laughter still dying on his face, replacing itself with something that was not yet fully formed, not quite fear, not quite shame, something between them that was fighting to become a feeling he could name. Obinna began crying, the high, ragged cry of a frightened child. Ifeoma held him through the shaking of her own arms and said his name against his face until the cry softened into shuddering breaths against her neck. Ades helped her to sit upright. Someone brought water. The men who had been drinking with Emeka stood at an awkward distance, uncertain of what this kind of moment required from them. Emeka moved through them and came and stood before Ifeoma, and she looked up at him from the ground where she was sitting. And something passed between them in that look that could not have passed through any conversation they had attempted in the previous months. He saw her. Not the image of the hard-working wife he had learned to rely on without noticing, not the background against which his own resting occurred. He saw her, a woman sitting on the red earth of her own compound, thin in a way he had not registered because the thinness had arrived gradually, her wrapper dusty, her hands shaking slightly, their son crying against her chest, and around her the scattered evidence of firewood she had carried from a farm she had walked to alone before the sunrise of a day he had spent in comfortable company. The shame that had lived in him as a nighttime feeling finally arrived in the afternoon. It was visible on his face. The men who had been laughing with him saw it and looked away. Even Obiora was quiet. Mama Nkechi came forward and helped Adaeze get Ifeoma fully upright. Her hands were practical and capable, and her face had changed. Something in it had shifted. Some certainty she always wore had cracked slightly at the edges. She spoke quietly, telling Ifeoma she needed to rest. She needed water. She had worked too hard today. And even as she said it, the words sounded different in her own mouth than they had ever sounded before. Because today, the results of the advice she had been giving were visible in a way that no amount of philosophy could make comfortable. Ifeoma's collapse was not a weather event, not an act of God, not bad luck. It was the conclusion of a sentence that had been building for a year, and everyone standing in that compound could read it. Emeka accompanied Ifeoma to the clinic. He walked beside her without speaking much, carrying Obinna on his own shoulder for the first time in longer than the child's memory, the boy's small arms wrapped around his father's neck with the uncomplicated trust of a child who does not know enough to be surprised by anything an adult does. Ifeoma walked carefully, her body still uncertain of itself, the dizziness having reduced but not entirely departed. She did not ask Emeka to come. He simply came, stood up from the bench, told Obiora and the others to go home, and was at her side before she had finished arranging herself for the walk. The clinic was a short walk, but felt longer. The nurse who received them was a compact, efficient woman named Nurse Chinyere, who had been in the village long enough to read what families were not saying. She checked Ifeoma's pressure, asked questions about her diet and her sleep and her water intake over the past weeks, and received answers that caused her to set down her pen and look at both of them with the particular expression of a medical professional who has decided that the medicine she needs to prescribe is not in her cabinet. She spoke plainly. She said that Ifeoma's body was showing the signs of someone who had been running on reserves for too long. Her blood pressure was elevated. Her weight was not where it should be for her height and build. The collapse was a warning, her body's announcement that it had reached the boundary of what it could sustain on what it had been given. She said this looking at Emeka for a significant portion of the time, not in an accusatory way, but in the way of a woman who understands where the information needs to land. She said also that Obinna needed another week of careful monitoring, that his recovery was progressing, but a child coming off that kind of fever needed rest and stability, and that his mother being exhausted created risk for the child as well, because a mother who was not eating enough and sleeping enough could not care for a sick child the way that child needed. Emeka listened. He sat on the wooden bench in the clinic corridor and listened to all of it, with his hands folded and his face carrying the expression of a man receiving information he had no way to argue with because it was written in front of him in the cat body of his own wife and child. On the walk home, he asked Ifeoma one question. "Why did you not tell me it was this bad?" She was quiet for a moment, adjusting Obinna's position in her arms. Then she said, "I told you what I could, and the rest I carried." He did not have an answer for that. They walked the rest of the way in a silence that was different from all the other silences of the past year, not cold, not avoidant, but thoughtful. The kind of silence that happens when a person is genuinely reconsidering something they had not known needed reconsidering. Change, when it is real, does not arrive like lightning. It arrives the way seeds become trees, slowly, sometimes invisibly, sometimes doubtfully, until the morning when you look and the shade is unmistakably there. In the days that followed, Emeka began moving differently in the compound. It started with small things rising earlier than he had in months, asking Ifeoma what needed to be done before she had time to begin doing it alone. He took Obinna to the morning check-in at the clinic himself, so Ifeoma could rest. He cooked ugali once and produced something edible, which surprised them both, and they laughed at the surprise in a way they had not laughed at anything together in a long time. He reached out to his old tailoring contacts. This required a kind of courage that is harder to name than physical courage, because it required him to admit, without explicitly admitting it, that time had passed and he had not kept up. He visited the workshop of a man he had apprenticed alongside years ago, a man who had continued steadily while Emeka stopped, and he sat with him and talked. The conversation was humbling. Coming back to something you have let sit unattended always is... But he made himself sit through the humbling, because the alternative, returning to the bench under the mango tree, while his wife's body continued paying the price of his resting, was no longer a thing he could make. Comfortable in his mind. The clinic corridor had permanently disrupted his comfort. He began distancing from Obiora, not dramatically, not with a confrontation, but with the quiet withdrawal of a man who has decided that a certain kind of companionship is taking more from him than it gives. Obiora noticed and made comments designed to pull Emeka back, pride comments, dignity comments, the usual language. But Emeka found, to his own surprise, that the comments no longer fit the same way. A person who has sat in a clinic corridor and heard a nurse describe his wife's deterioration in measurable terms does not have much use anymore for philosophies about pride. Ifeoma rested. This was harder for her than any of the working had been, because rest required trust, and trust required believing that what she let go of would actually be held. She watched Emeka move around the compound and tried to hold the watching lightly, neither with excessive hope nor with the guarded distance of a woman who has been disappointed too many times to lower her guard fully. She rested her body, she ate, she drank the tonics Nurse Chinyere had given her. She slept past sunrise 2 mornings in a row and woke each time to find that the compound had not collapsed from her absence. Adaize came to sit with her one afternoon, bringing a pot of vegetable soup. They spoke plainly, as they sometimes did in the privacy of Ifeoma's kitchen, the kind of speaking that women do when they have stopped performing patience at each other and are simply talking. Ifeoma told Adaize about the clinic. Adaize listened without interrupting. When Ifeoma finished, Adaize said, "You know, I have been wanting to say something to you for a long time." Ifeoma said she knew. They sat with that for a moment, the both of them, and then Adaize said, "You are the strongest person I know. I only wish someone had told you earlier that strength is not supposed to be used against yourself." Ifeoma said nothing, but she remembered the sentence later when she was alone, turning it over, wearing it in. The elder women returned, as elder women do, because the concern was genuine even when the advice had been inadequate. Mama Nkechi came one evening near sundown when the compound was quieter, and she sat with Ifeoma in the way of a woman who has been reconsidering something. She did not fully retract what she had said before. A woman of 63 who has survived on certain beliefs does not easily abandon them, but her tone had shifted. She told Ifeoma that patience in marriage was still important. She said it was what held many homes together when nothing else could. But then she said something she had not said before. Patience should not kill you. A living woman can still save her home. A woman who has broken herself cannot. It was not a complete revolution. It was a small turning of a large ship, but Ifeoma received it as what it was, an elder woman looking at the consequences of her own advice and finding the courage to add something to it. She thanked Mama Nkechi with the genuine respect she had always given her, and the old woman left the compound looking slightly lighter, as though some weight she had not known she was carrying had been partially set down. By the time the next Harmattan came, the compound felt different in ways that would have been difficult to quantify, but were easy to sense if you knew what the compound had felt like before. Emeka had returned, through his contact, to tailoring work. He was not yet where he had imagined being at this stage of his life. The shop with his name above the door was still a future thing, not a present one. But his hands were busy with fabric again, and a man whose hands are busy stops needing to fill the empty hours with borrowed philosophy. He had set up a working space in one corner of the compound, and the sound of the machine, a newer one, bought on credit from a cooperative that Ifeoma had actually discovered and told him about, was one of the sounds of the yard now. And it was not a small thing. the sound of the machine. They spoke more. Not perfectly, two people do not undo a year of distance in a season. But they spoke with the tentative seriousness of people who have decided that speaking is worth the risk of what speaking might reveal. Emeka asked about the farm sometimes, and sometimes even came to it. Ifeoma told him about the freezer idea she had set aside, and this time the conversation about it did not stop. It continued over several evenings, becoming a plan, then a specific plan, then something they were actually moving toward together with the combined intention that she had imagined for their marriage when she was still young enough to imagine things freely. Obinna recovered fully. He grew, the way children grow when the house they are growing in begins to carry itself more evenly into health, into a particular brightness, into the kind of small boy confidence that comes from seeing both parents present and functional. He did not know what he was growing in, could not have named it. But children absorb the emotional weather of their homes through the skin, and the weather had changed. The compound itself held its stories quietly, the way all compounds do, all the layers of what had happened there compressing gradually into the ground and the walls, becoming part of the texture of the place without erasing it. The wooden bench under the mango tree remained. Emeka sat on it sometimes in the evenings when the day's work was done, and occasionally Ifeoma sat beside him, and they watched the evening together without either of them having to carry the whole of it alone. Those evenings were small and ordinary, and their ordinariness was the whole point. Mama Nkechi continued her advising in the village. She did not stop, because stopping was not in her nature and was not needed. The village needed its elders, needed the wisdom of people who had survived long enough to have perspective. But those who paid close attention noticed, in the following months, that her advice included something it had not always included before. Alongside the patience she always recommended, she began adding a sentence, different forms of the same sentence, about the importance of a husband seeing his wife's burden before the burden crushed her. She wove it differently each time she said it, but it was always there, a new thread in the old cloth. Some people noticed it. Ifeoma noticed it. Neither of them said anything about it directly. Some understandings between women do not require naming. Adaeze continued, as she had always been steady, perceptive, quiet about her perceptiveness, generous with the small things that cost little money but mean a great deal. She watched the compound through the months and saw the changes with the satisfaction of a person who has placed a seed in the ground and waited with enough patience to actually see it become something. She asked Ifeoma one day, several months after everything, whether Ifeoma was happy. Not whether the marriage was saved, not whether the home was stable, whether she, Ifeoma, was happy. Ifeoma was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet before she said something true. Then she said, "I am becoming something. I do not know yet what the full shape of it is, but it feels like it is mine." Adaeze nodded. That was enough. The story of Ifeoma and Emeka is not a story about the failure of tradition or the failure of elder wisdom. The elder women were not wrong to value endurance. Endurance is genuinely necessary in the building of anything that lasts, including a marriage. The community was not wrong to want peace. Emeka was not a monster. He was a man who had lost his way and been kept comfortable in his lostness by someone who benefited from his staying comfortable. None of the elements of this story are simple. What the story reveals is something more careful, that wisdom, however genuine, can become dangerous when it is applied without seeing the full picture of the person it is being applied to. Mama Nkechi's medicine was real medicine, but it was being given to someone who needed not only patience, but also to be seen, to speak, to be met halfway by the person she had promised to build a life with. Patience without that meeting was not building a marriage. It was building Ifeoma's silent collapse. The collapse, painful, public, frightening, became the truest thing to happen in that compound in a long time because it made visible what had been invisible. A woman's exhaustion, sustained privately and covered by quiet dignity, had finally expressed itself in the language of the body, which is the only language that cannot be politely set aside. And because it was finally visible, it could finally be addressed. True endurance, the kind that actually builds something, is not the endurance of someone who has learned to carry everything alone without complaint. It is the endurance of two people who have agreed, imperfectly and with effort, and sometimes with failure, to keep trying to carry things together. The first kind produces suffering. The second kind produces a life. Ifeoma understood this by the end, and she understood it not by turning against the elder women or against the tradition she had grown up in, but by understanding that within that tradition, within the very concept of wisdom that Mama Nkechi embodied, there was room for this truth. A woman's strength is a gift to her family, not a resource to be exhausted in her silence. And a good marriage is one where both people know the difference. Respecting elders is valuable. Their experience carries truths that younger people have not yet earned through their own living. But the deepest respect you can give to the wisdom of an elder is to apply it thoughtfully, to ask not only what the advice says, but whether it sees you fully, whether it accounts for the particular weight of your particular life, whether, in protecting the marriage, it also protects the woman inside it. Because a marriage without the woman it was supposed to shelter is not a saved marriage. It is only an empty compound with a wooden bench under a mango tree. And Ifeoma had spent enough of her years serving empty things. From now on, she would know the difference. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.